Hi, class. I'm Dr. J, and today is a continuation of our discourse on the African American experience. In the last segment, I presented on the prelude to the Civil War. And during that presentation, I spoke about how there's a thread of freedom that runs throughout the narrative of African American history. And we're going to continue with that concept today. As I mentioned to you, our elders often referred to the Civil War as the war for freedom. And we must ask ourselves, why was it necessary to fight a war for freedom in the land of the free? And so we're going to attempt to interrogate that question. We're going to talk about some of the events that were salient in the Civil War and also in the period of Reconstruction. And we're referring to that period as a national betrayal. And that's where we'll end the discourse today of identifying exactly what was betrayed and how it was betrayed. We'll start off talking about the lost peace. And that is that General Lee surrendered his army to Ulysses S. Grant, the general commander of the Union forces at Appomattox Courthouse. And that surrender was on April 9th, 1865. One of the salient facts of that surrender was that very lenient terms were negotiated with the rebel army, the army that had gone to war with its nation, that had declared itself a separate confederacy, that held a large share of the responsibility for the loss of 750,000 American lives. The terms of surrender were such that Robert E. Lee was able to keep his weapons, his horse, all of his officers kept their sidearms. And at the end of the day, after discussing and agreeing upon terms, the officers climbed back on their horses and rode home with 28,000 members of their armies. There were no prosecutions, right? Nobody was held responsible for the carnage that occurred during that war. And I believe this was the beginning of a strong inclination to heal the nation, but at what expense? And so these states, these 11 states that went to war with their nation, are really where our focus is going to be today, because this is where the majority of African Americans were concentrated. And this is where the preponderance of the Reconstruction that was going on in the country was taking place. I'm going to start with a personal story. My family's from the South. My mother from New Orleans, Louisiana. My father from Wilmington, North Carolina. And the couple that I was just showing you there were my great-grandparents, my maternal great-grandparents. Isaiah Vinson was a preacher, very successful preacher. He founded several churches during his life, and he pastored 3 of those churches. One of them was in existence and functioning as a church right up until the Katrina flood. His wife, Mary Lottie Mackey, was a missionary. She was educated. She attended Leland College. She's the granddaughter of a white slave master by the name of Augustus Mayer. these two were a formidable couple. His father, his name was George Winston, and George Winston fought in the Civil War. So we have a long line of service in my family and a long line of people who were raised in the Southern culture. His mother was Emmeline Johnson, and I spoke about her. She was my great-grandmother on my maternal side, who I spoke about having to shack up during slavery and breed with other men in order to feed the market in the southern states. And this was during the time of the internal slave trade after 1808, when the slave trade was abolished in the United States. That was his mother. His father was George Winston from Richmond, Virginia, who ran away from his master, made it all the way to Canada. When the war started, he found his way back into the country. He was mustered into the Union Army in Concord, New Hampshire, and he fought in the 127th Regiment of the United States Colored Troops. My great aunt told me that he used to tell stories about how most of the combat was hand to hand, and he was very proud that he left that war without a scratch on him. We have George Winston's military record here, the 127th U.S. Colored Troops, George Winston. He was in Company B. He was 23 years old when he entered. He was from the area of Drury Bluff, which is right outside of Richmond, Virginia. That's where he ran away from. We also have, as part of our story, that he very likely ran into William Stills in Philadelphia. There's an account, because Stills took very careful documented records of all of the fugitives that came through Philadelphia. And he took their name, he wrote a description of them, he wrote down their story, and he wanted this information to be useful to African Americans so that they could find their relatives after the carnage and the disruption of the Civil War. But one of those persons that he documented was a Joe Winston from Richmond, Virginia, who worked as a bartender, who was reddish brown, right? And the description that my great aunt and my grandmother gave me of him fit this to a T. One thing, they told me that he changed his name. Another thing they told me was that he used to make some of the best drinks that anybody ever had around Christmas time. He used to make an eggnog, and he used to get everybody drunk on his eggnog. It was so good. And then when they got drunk, he would slip some of the eggnog to the kids. And so they loved him around Christmas time. And my great aunt told me that he was a beautiful man. He was this reddish brown color, and that's why Emmeline fell in love with him. So it's very likely that we're talking about the same person. And that's the personal connection I have with not only the Civil War, but also with the South. This is George Winston's company. We got this from the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C., highly recommended. You must go to the African American Museum, but also go to the African American Civil War Museum. It is equally as impressive. Also fighting in the Civil War was Riley Shepard. This is my paternal great-grandfather, who was also a Civil War veteran. And this is a picture outside of the Civil War Museum in DC that I'm sure all of you are going to try to get to. At the end of slavery, the 13th Amendment was passed. And the 13th Amendment really abolished slavery or involuntary servitude. right, within the borders of the United States. The only exception that it made were for people who were incarcerated. And so they could be worked for free. And of course, in the South, we know, and the rest of the country, there has been a historical legacy of exploiting particularly poor people, and of those poor people, particularly poor people of color, right, who are disproportionately represented as cheap labor in our prisons and have been throughout our history. But that amendment put an end to slavery, but it did not put an end to the needs of the slave. So a Bureau of Refugee and Freedmen was developed. And this was called the Freedmen's Bureau for short. And it happened in March 1865. And what they were concerned with was providing for all the needs of the formerly enslaved. And so it provided them with training, it provided them with clothing, it provided them with medical care. It recruited teachers because slaves were denied the right to read. To come into the South, many of the missionaries, but other lay people came and taught schools and taught the former slaves who were now freed, but were not literate because that was against the law in the South, to read, to write, and they're receiving these services from the federal government through the Freedmen's Bureau. So it was providing a critical service throughout the South in basically providing for the basic needs of formerly enslaved people. But at this time, there was contention, right? You had a tendency for many Northerners to believe that a very aggressive form of Reconstruction needed to occur in the South. Is that the former Confederates who had fought against the nation were not going to easily, right, accept any type of social equity with their former slaves. And so there needed to be aggressive attempts to provide for the needs of them. And so there were attempts to provide land, and they didn't pull through. There were attempts to provide employment, high-paying employment, and that was not consistently successful because there was a lot of pushback on the side, not only of the Southerners, who, as I said, were not being treated harshly, but also on the part of many of their representatives in Congress, who were the Democrats at this time. And so when Lincoln was assassinated, the same month that Robert E. Lee surrendered, April of '65, a Southern patriot to the South, somebody loyal to the rebel cause, someone loyal to a cause that allowed them to think nothing of going and assassinating the President of the United States, the one who had fought so hard to keep this country together, right? He was assassinated that same month in April. And he was followed into the presidency by Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson was a Southerner, and he was sympathetic to slavery. And so you had, after Lincoln, his vice president who came into power as president was pushing back in the direction of a quick and easy reconciliation with the South. And he was fighting with Congress over this issue. And then you had Black people, right, between a rock and a hard place. They hadn't had the opportunities to provide for their basic needs. There were basic things that they needed to learn. There was basic care that they needed. There was basic information that they needed. And there was also an attempt to allow Southerners to return back to normal as quickly as possible. And so they found themselves between a rock and a hard place. Congress had to push back against Andrew Johnson. He tried to veto the Civil Rights Act. He tried to veto the Freedmen's Bureau Act. He was opposed to reconstructing the South too quickly. He made arguments like we already had services to slaves, and former slaves with the confiscation acts. And aren't those sufficient to take care of their needs? We don't need to rush into anything now that they were free. In other words, he was stalling on the idea of providing aid and assistance to people who had been held in bondage in this land of the free for hundreds of years, generationally. He was hesitant. And that created a conflict between him and the Republican Party, particularly the radicals in the party, and they had to override his vetoes to bring in basic civil rights acts, providing for the right to vote, to providing for the right to access services, to providing for the right to just have basic relief. But from the Southern perspective, the Southerners who were quickly trying to regain control of the South and reestablish white supremacy in the South, from their perspective, they were perpetuating an image of the Negro that they had developed to suit their needs during slavery. The lazy, happy-go-lucky slave who was distrustful, who had a distaste for work and so forth, and without the benevolent hand of the white man looking after him, he wouldn't have been able to even take care of himself, let alone produce anything for anyone else. This was their narrative during slavery, the happy-go-lucky, lazy slave. And so they tried to perpetuate that same image during Reconstruction. You have here, in the print, the white man must work to keep his children and pay his taxes. And then over here, you have the Black person just lying down, doing nothing. What do I need to work for? As long as they got them appropriations, that's what he's saying, right? So this is the image of the Freedmen's Bureau that's being perpetuated in the South. And it's a very malicious image. It's a false image, but it is an image that was very attractive to the consciousness of people who had held people in bondage for 300 years, wanting to believe that they were not suited for freedom, wanting to believe that they were not workers, despite the fact that they had produced the labor that made the United States a world power. Despite the fact that they had produced more cotton over a 40-year period before the beginning of the Civil War, with pre-industrialization, that then was produced for the 40 years from 1870 to 1910 using mechanization. So America did not become a world power and dominate 60% of the cotton market because Black people were lazy. But that was a useful stereotype, like the new stereotypes that came into existence at the end of slavery during Reconstruction. One was of the Zip Coon, who was, an empty-headed person who just liked to gamble and was very familiar with a razor, but couldn't be trusted. The image of the salacious African-American beast who you couldn't trust around your woman because he was thought of as a lustful animal. A beast, actually, was the term often referred to. And of course, the white man had to be encouraged to take action to protect his woman from him. This is part of the narrative, right? And so this narrative, of course, could justify segregation. It could justify abuse, over policing, incarceration, lynchings, chasing people out of not only their homes, but out of entire towns in the South. That behavior can be justified if one can perpetuate the proper narrative and get people who really want to consume it, people who are recovering from being devastated during the Civil War and need someone to blame it on other than themselves for holding slaves, for working people, right? And living off of their blood and sweat, right? Instead of blaming themselves for indulging in such inhumane behavior, unchristian behavior, I might add. No, let's blame it on the slave. Back to presentation. So at the war's end, you had these images that were proliferating, and of course, Aunt Jemima, who was just happy to serve in the kitchen and be of service to master. Also a gross misrepresentation of the African-American woman, desexualizing her, distorting her image, suggesting that her only value was in happily serving white people. That was the image. And she was, of course, this image was associated with many different foodstuffs that you found not only throughout the South, but throughout the country. During this early period after the end of the Civil War, Black codes were coming into existence in the South. They had already started in the North. As early as, the 1850s, you have these Black codes happening in different places in the Midwest and in the North. But these were laws that came into existence to control the movement of Black people in the South, and basically to keep them in a subservient condition as an easily exploited labor pool, right? And to keep them as an reminder of the superiority of white people at all time in the South. No matter what Black people attained, it was always not good enough to put them on the same level with their white neighbor. These Black codes existed, as I was saying, in the North and in the South. For instance, as early as 1816, 1818, you had codes in Indiana and in Illinois, in Ohio as well. They passed laws requiring Blacks who moved into the state to produce legal documents verifying that they were free. They had to post bonds, right, that were designating that they were on good behavior. You had instances where Black schools were burned down in Ohio, in Indiana, and in other cities. You had anti-immigration legislation that was targeted towards Black people in particular in Iowa, in Illinois, and other places. In Oregon Territory, you had laws that came into existence in 1844 that said that Black people could not own land in Oregon Territory. And if they came into Oregon Territory, these are not enslaved people, these are free Black people. They couldn't live there for more than 2 years. They had to keep on moving. And if they didn't, they would be beaten. And if they persisted after that, they would be jailed and fined. That was Oregon Territory. And so what is important to understand is that there was a series of 3 amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. We talked about the 13th already, and the 14th was to grant citizenship. They were directed towards African Americans in particular, to say that now these freedmen are in fact citizens and have all rights of citizens, and those rights shall not be abridged by anyone based on race, color, creed. And then voting rights. Now, why was it necessary to actually even have to pass an amendment for voting rights if people were already citizens? Because many of the states in the South didn't ratify the 14th Amendment. This is directly after the war, after being defeated. They pushed back and wouldn't ratify the 14th Amendment. And so they had to pass the 15th Amendment to actually add more teeth to the legislation. So you had the Freedmen's Bureau, And then you had a series of 3 amendments. You had Civil Rights Acts from 1866 that granted citizenship and outlawed these Black codes that had come into existence. You had Reconstruction Acts that were aimed at also providing protection for Black people in the South so that they could gain a living and so that they could exercise their right to vote. You had enforcement acts that were passed because there was resistance on the part of Southerners to ratifying the 14th Amendment, to the Civil Rights Acts, to the other enforcement acts. There was pushback. There was intimidation of federal workers. There was intimidation of the what they called the carpetbaggers. Many of the benevolent whites who came to the South to help were just classified as carpetbaggers, and part of the Camelot history that they taught in the country for a long time referred to the Northerners in the South as carpetbaggers, when most of them were there on benevolent missions and not there to exploit anyone. The Civil Rights Act of 1871 is also called the Ku Klux Klan Act, and this was needed to direct itself at the Klan because the Klan had formalized into a terrorist organization. Despite the narrative that it was a social club, it did do some benevolent things. I mean, it helped out widows and things like that, but it was formed by, Confederates. Their first grand wizard was Bedford Forrest. We'll talk about him in a second. And not only was he a Confederate general, but he was a Confederate general who was associated with massacres of Black people because he wouldn't recognize them as soldiers. And so when his troops captured Black soldiers, they summarily executed them and dumped them in a pit. That's the man who became the first Grand Wizard of the Klan. So let's not talk about the Klan in any other way other than the terrorist organization that it was. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 is another one. And again, just trying to reinforce the fact that Black people should have a right to public accommodations, the same rights that anybody else in the country should have. So let's dig into these Black codes a little bit to see what the counter narrative was that was going on at the same time. So we'll pick a state like Louisiana. This is the laws that they started passing. Be it ordained by the police jury of the parish that no Negro shall be allowed to pass within the limits of this parish, parishes like county, without special permit in writing from his employer. So you've got to have a permit with you if you come in. Every Negro who shall be found absent from the residence of his employer after 10 o'clock at night without a written permit from his employer shall be fined, put in jail, and then you'll be sold out to work on some farm for free for a few years. No Negro shall be permitted to rent or keep a house within said parish. And on and on. Every Negro is required to be in the regular service of some white person or former owner who shall be held responsible for the conduct of said Negro. So you could not be a free person in Louisiana if you were a Black person. You needed to carry a pass wherever you went. And you needed to, if you walked the street, to show how you were in the employment of some other person, particularly a white person. You couldn't meet in public. You couldn't congregate. You couldn't carry a cane. You could go to church services conducted by white ministers and priests. Listen at that. So even the Black church was not trusted because we know that a lot of the organizing went on in the Black church, and a lot of the upliftment of Black people went on in the Black church. That was our primary institution. And so they ruled that out. You can only go to a church where there's a white minister or priest. No Negro shall be permitted to preach, right? No Negro who is not in the military service shall be allowed to carry a firearm or any other kind of weapon. No, it doesn't apply to whites. They're carrying weapons every which way. No Negro shall sell, barter, or exchange any articles of merchandise or traffic within said parish without. So you couldn't even engage in commerce in the parish. So what they're doing is reinstating slavery by another name called disenfranchisement, called segregation, called Jim Crow. Any Negro found drunk within said parish shall pay a fine of $5. Multiply that by 20. And how do you come up with $100 if you don't have employment? And if you're employed, you're making at best a nickel an hour. And on and on and on. And so what the reaction to this was that the federal government instituted the Reconstruction Act of 1867. And in this act, they sent military troops into the South. They divided the South into these 5 regions that you see here. Each of them had a commander, and they protected the rights of the freemen with those troops. And it was during this time that Reconstruction started to gain a little bit more traction, from 1867 for about 7 or 8 years. But it's a short-lived period. So it happened in these 10 southern states. The states were forced to ratify the 14th Amendment, or they were going to continue to be ruled by the military. African-American men were guaranteed the right to vote throughout these 10 states. It banned former Confederate leaders from holding office because they had immediately come back into office in the South. And to rejoin the Union, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment and submit new constitutions to Congress, constitutions that provided for the rights of all citizens. And so Reconstruction started then to actually happen. But the Ku Klux Klan had formed, and the White Camellias had formed, and several other terrorist organizations had formed, and Black people were being attacked. And you had a massacre in Louisiana, in Appaloosas. Black folks wanted to organize, right? And they wanted to join a Democratic political group. The white Democratic members of the white supremacist organization, the Knights, drove them out. So they were trying to have a united front with other workers, right? Both the other workers being Democrats, and they wanted to join with them to solidify themselves as workers. But the white supremacy in the South wasn't going to tolerate that type of unity. And so they attacked the Black folks, and they mobilized thousands of people to kind of police them. People were shot. Many of the Black leaders were captured. 12 leaders of the Black Republicans who surrendered were executed. And there was a wave of violence against Black people in the surrounding parishes. And they're not sure how many people actually died. Sometimes people say it was at least 250 people. The official number was 5. But those types of mass sporadic reactions on the parts of whites was in Southern whites in particular, but you also had violent actions that were taking places in places in the Midwest and in the West as well. 15th Amendment, again, as a voters' rights, this is passed. It's passed in Congress in 1969. Again, it's ratified in 1870, and several states accept it and some don't. It was supported by 30 states. It was rejected by California, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Oregon. Oregon did not ratify the 15th Amendment until around the time of the Second World War. You'll have to look up the exact date, but I believe it was in the 50s and not the 40s. And so the South is focused on redeeming itself, and it's not going to be able to do this as long as the the Northern troops are present. And it's not going to be able to do this if they allow Black people to continue to gain power, because what's happening is Black people are voting, and in areas where you have a large Black populations, they're voting Black people into office, and they're serving both at the local, state level, and some of them are going on to the U.S. Congress and serving in the U.S. Congress. And the redeemers in the South who want to redeem Camelot, who want to redeem the system of slavery and in a new form, you're right, called segregation. They are pushing back against this. And this is the image that they see with these Northerners coming in, riding this beast into the South. And redemption is the only solution, and it's going to have to happen by force. So these folks didn't learn their lesson by the Civil War. 750,000 Americans dead was not sufficient to teach them a lesson. The carnage to their major cities like Richmond and Petersburg and Atlanta and Savannah and Charleston, the carnage that happened in their cities was not sufficient. They still want to return back to a situation where they want to place other people beneath their feet so that they can walk on them to feel tall themselves. The Klan is pernicious at this time. And as I said, they were out in the open. It wasn't like they were hidden. It wasn't like the Northern troops couldn't find them, but in all honesty, when the Northern troops came in 67, the Klan became less active for about 5 or 6 years, right? And then right as the Northern troops are leaving, then they became most active. And so they were reacting to the circumstances. Actually, Bedford Forrest even claimed that he wasn't a Klan member when he was interrogated at this time. He was the Grand Wizard of the Klan. So you had the Klan and other secret organizations that were proliferating. The message of the Klan was to eliminate, the Ku Klux Klan Act was to eliminate extra-legal violence that was happening. It was also to protect the 14th Amendment and to make sure that the equal protection under the law was being realized by free Black people. And it was to control vigilante groups who were roaming. The political defeat of the Republican Party was another one of the aims of the Klan. Another aim that they had was the restoration and maintenance of white supremacy, and particularly in response to this idea that Blacks were gaining a livelihood that was looked at as being just unacceptable. How can a white man have a Black man doing better than him? It's impossible even to contemplate, because they had constructed Black people as inherently inferior. And they needed to believe that, because to not believe it would have a person to have to interrogate what they had been perpetrating for the last 4 or 5 generations in the South. And they wanted to expel what they called the Northern carpetbaggers from the South. And they were anybody that was sympathetic to the situation of Black people. Those were the carpetbaggers. And we had, of course, Bedford Forrest misrepresenting that he was even in the Klan. The 15th Amendment then comes in and ratified in 70. And oh yeah, Oregon, here's the date. They didn't ratify the 15th Amendment until 1959. And I say this to say that apartheid, or Jim Crow, was found in every state in the Union. And it was prevalent in the new territories that opened up, like Kansas, Nebraska, right, and Oregon Territory. It was prevalent because many of the people migrating there were migrating there from Missouri and migrating there from Texas, and they brought that mentality with them. And what they were intent on was perpetuating the myth that Black people were inferior and that Black people were a threat unless they were under the benign control of white people. That was the myth that they wanted to perpetuate. that Black men were unable to control their drives. They were like animals, and your women couldn't be safe around them. That was the myth that they wanted to perpetuate. But, there was a lot of rape going on in the South, but it wasn't Black women raping white men. The Colfax massacre of 1873, right? And again, this happened in Louisiana, and voters in 72 were split, mostly Black Republicans, and you had about 22,000, so a close number of white voters. Local white Democrat leaders called for armed supporters to help them, and they took arms against Blacks because they had outvoted them. More than 300 armed white men, including white supremacists such as the Knights of White Camellia and the KKK, attacked approximately 150 African Americans, killed including 48 who were murdered after the battle. So you had 150 African Americans killed, and 48 of them were killed after the battle was over. Only 3 whites were killed in this. And these are the type of massacres that were prevalent, is that you had a disproportionate number of Black people dying, and they would call them like rebellions. They would say the Blacks are rioting or the Blacks are rebelling, and we had to fight against them. And then when you look at the numbers, almost everybody that was killed was Black. So if they were rebelling, why weren't they killing anybody? Why was it that they're getting killed if they're the ones who were perpetuating the carnage? It seemed like it was the other way around, and it was. It was a form of social control. Terror against Black people was a form of social control. And the form that it came in was, it's multiple forms, but denying them access to the ballot, not recognizing their elected officials when they did come into power, disenfranchising them when they were voted into office, terrorizing them and murdering them if necessary to maintain white control in the South. And while this was going on, there were federal troops in the South. Imagine what would have happened if they weren't there. You had congressmen, from Louisiana. This is John R. Lynch. He was born a slave, purchased his freedom, became successful, became a lawyer, and went into public office in Mississippi, in Louisiana, and in Mississippi. And he served in the local state government in Mississippi, and then he also represented them in the US Congress. But he says, he makes this speech talking about why these civil rights bills are so important. And I think it's important to hear his voice. The colored people, in asking the passage of this bill, just as it passed the Senate, do not thereby admit that their children can be better educated in white than in colored schools, nor that white teachers, because they are white, are better qualified to teach than colored ones. But they recognize the fact that the distinction, when made and tolerated by law, is an unjust and odious prescription, that you make their color a grounds of objection and consequently a crime. That is what we most earnestly protest against. Let us confer upon all citizens, then, the rights to which they are entitled under the Constitution. So you have these Black elected officials pushing back, making the argument both at the local and at the national level, but it's insufficient to turn the tide, which brings us to Hayes-Tilden. So you had a presidential election of 1876. The Republican candidate, and that was the party of Lincoln, the Progressive Party at the time, was Rutherford B. Hayes. And Tilden was the Democratic candidate. And Tilden had more votes than Hayes counted in the presidential election in the southern states. And there were 3 states that were being contested: Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. And so what the Dixiecrats did, the Southern Democrats did, is they proposed a deal. And this is outside of Congress. This was a deal that actually happened in in the smoking lounge of a hotel called the Wormley Hotel. It's actually a Black-owned hotel in DC at the time. And they met there, you know, in the stereotypical kind of smoke-filled room with their cigars and so forth. They weren't taking, there was no one taking notes, and they came up with a gentleman's agreement, which then became known as the Wormley Compromise, because it happened in that hotel. They didn't even know what to name it. Then it's sometimes called the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. And sometimes it's called the Compromise of 1877. It has lots of names because it was unofficial. And the compromise was that the Southerners said, if you will remove the Northern troops from the South, we will give you the electoral votes in the 3 states that are being contested, and your candidate will win the presidency. So you'll have a Republican in the White House. And the Republicans accepted the offer. So they, in order to maintain power, this is how sometimes morally corrupt people are, in order to stay in power, they turned the South back over to the Confederates 12 years after the end of the war. And 12 turbulent years, right? Where there still were lynchings and there was terrorism going on and there were people refusing to ratify the 14th Amendment. And there was really an extreme pushback on the part of the Confederates. The Republican Party turned the South back over to the former Confederate leaders. And their first order of business was to put Black people back in their place. That was their first order of business. And this was the betrayal. Because how can a nation expend so much of its precious resource, its blood, right? 750,000 lives lost, and then win the war and just so cavalierly overpower and position, make a truce with your former adversary and turn over the people who were the subject of the war back to them to be treated as they will. And this is really the story that we're going to continue to tell. And so when we talk about segregation and we talk about Jim Crow, none of it is possible without the Hayes-Tilden Compromise and the removal of those troops. And the fact that the Republican Party could care so little about the lives and the security and the safety of Black people suggests that we still have not recovered from the sin and the stain of slavery. So we're going to leave it there for now. And I want everybody to be well, stay well, and we're going to stop recording.